The scream tore through Jack Morrison, a silent, internal ripcord pulled decades too late. He bolted upright in bed, the phantom vibrations of a dying aircraft still humming through his bones, the ghost of Arctic cold clinging to his sweat-soaked skin. For a moment, he was not a 78-year-old man in a quiet Arizona retirement bungalow, but a 30-year-old Air Force captain strapped into a cockpit, watching the world unravel. The dream was always the same. The memory polished to a sharp, painful gleam by 60 years of repetition. First came the static, a white noise shriek that swallowed the radio and the frantic voices of his crew. Then the lights, not the gentle shimmer of the aurora, but a violent, pulsating emerald that bled from the storm clouds below, illuminating a structure of impossible scale and geometry. It rose, a silent leviathan from the ice, its surface alive with a light that seemed to drink the darkness rather than cast it out. In the dream, he could feel the terror of his co-pilot, Mike, a palpable heat beside him, and hear the navigator, Dave, muttering scientific impossibilities that curdled into prayers. The cockpit would shake, not from turbulence, but from a deep, resonant hum that vibrated in his teeth and made the fillings ache. Jack swung his legs over the side of the bed, the worn floorboards cool under his bare feet. The digital clock on the nightstand glowed 3:17 a.m. The witching hour. It had always been the witching hour. He padded into the small, tidy kitchen, the routine as ingrained as the nightmare itself. He did not turn on the overhead light, preferring the solitary glow of the stove lamp as he filled a kettle. His hands, once steady enough to guide a multi-million-dollar aircraft through a blizzard, now trembled slightly. A faint, constant tremor that was part age, part perpetual adrenaline hangover. He carried his tea to the living room, settling into his worn armchair by the window. Outside, the desert was still and silent, a vast expanse of nothing under a blanket of stars. It was the polar opposite of the chaotic, blinding white of his memory. For 60 years, he had carried the weight of that sky, the secret of that thing they had seen. The official debriefing had been a masterclass in gaslighting, hallucinations brought on by extreme pressure and atmospheric phenomena, faulty instruments, a shared high-altitude psychosis. They had taken the logs, the film, their dignity. They had given them stern looks and firm handshakes and orders to forget, and he had tried. God, how he had tried. He had buried himself in a civilian career, in a marriage that eventually succumbed to the unspoken chasm of his past, in the quiet rituals of a life designed to be forgettable. But the thing in the ice refused to be forgotten. It was a lodestone in his mind, pulling him back to that moment of pure, unadulterated awe and terror. It was the ghost at every family dinner, the shadow in every happy memory, the cold truth that sat beside him in this very chair night after night. He sipped the bitter tea, the heat a small, tangible anchor in the vast, cold sea of his thoughts. The fear was not just a memory, it was a living thing. It was the dread that they had been wrong to cover it up, that the thing they had encountered was not just a strange phenomenon but a presence, and that its silence over the decades was not a comfort but a patient, gathering storm. He was the sole keeper of a terrible truth, a sentinel guarding a door that should never be opened again, and the isolation of that duty was a colder, deeper chill than any Arctic wind. The haunting was not in the dream. The haunting was in the waking, in the relentless, silent burden of a truth that could not be spoken. The morning sun had barely begun to paint the desert sky in hues of orange and violet when the familiar dread found a new, sharper edge. Jack sat in his armchair, the local news a low murmur in the background, a mundane soundtrack to his solitary existence. He was about to take a sip of his cooling coffee when the broadcast cut to a breaking news segment. A fresh-faced correspondent stood bundled against a stark white landscape, a graphic of the Arctic Circle swirling on the screen behind her. The words hit him like a physical blow. Unexplained radar anomalies, the reporter said, her voice crisp with professional curiosity. A series of massive energy signatures detected deep beneath the polar ice cap, defying conventional explanation. They showed grainy, declassified satellite imagery, thermal scans depicting a colossal shift in heat source. The military, the report stated, was investigating but had no comment. Jack's cup rattled in its saucer as he set it down, his heart hammering against his ribs. He leaned forward, his breath catching in his throat. The images on the screen were not just similar. They were identical. The scale, the thermal output, the way the signature seemed to pulse with a slow, rhythmic cadence. It was a perfect, chilling echo of the blips that had first danced across their own primitive scopes in 1962. The same impossible movement against the planet's magnetic field. The same colossal, hidden presence. 60 years of silence, of disciplined forgetting, shattered in an instant by a cable news broadcast. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. This was not a memory anymore. It was a recurrence. The patient storm he had feared was gathering, and it was happening now in real time, while the world watched with detached scientific interest. The officials on the news spoke of solar flares, of unique geological activity, their lies polished and plausible. He knew the script. He had lived it. They would investigate, they would obfuscate, and they would bury the truth all over again, leaving another generation unprepared for whatever was waking beneath the ice. The weight of his secret, a burden he had carried for so long it had become part of his skeleton, suddenly felt unbearable. It was no longer just his past haunting him. It was the world's future. The compulsion to act, a feeling he had suppressed for 6 decades, rose in his chest like a tide. He had to speak. Someone had to know what they were truly dealing with, to understand that this was not a new phenomenon, but an old one stirring from its slumber. But with the compulsion came a familiar, icy fear. The men in dark suits from the debriefing, their eyes devoid of warmth, their promises of consequences should he ever break his oath. What would they do to an old man who dared to disrupt their careful global narrative? He thought of Mike, his old co-pilot, who had retreated into a life of terrified silence, and Dave, who had taken his own confused terror to an early grave. Speaking up felt like a betrayal of their shared vow, a desecration of the trauma they had endured together. He stood, his joints protesting, and walked to the window. The peaceful desert vista now seemed like a gilded cage. He looked at his reflection in the glass, an old man with haunted eyes, the last living witness to an apocalypse that had been postponed, not canceled. The silence was no longer a shield, it had become a collaborator. The dread was no longer a ghost from his past. It was a premonition. He had to break his silence. The risk was immense, the potential fallout terrifying, but the cost of saying nothing, of letting history repeat its most terrible secret, was a price his conscience could no longer bear. The echo had sounded, and after a lifetime of listening, he finally had to answer. The telephone felt like a relic in Jack's hand, a heavy, cold brick of black plastic that seemed to pulse with the weight of his decision. He had found her name after hours of tense, furtive online searches, his fingers clumsy on the keyboard, the glow of the monitor illuminating the deep lines of worry on his face. Sarah Klein, an investigative journalist with a reputation for digging into military cover-ups and environmental mysteries, her byline attached to stories that often vanished from mainstream news feeds as quickly as they appeared. She was a risk, but she was the only option. His small study was shrouded in the deep quiet of the afternoon, the only sound the frantic thumping of his own heart. He had rehearsed this moment a dozen times, the words forming and dissolving in his mind. But now, with the receiver pressed to his ear, listening to the rhythmic purr of the dial tone, every rehearsed line evaporated, leaving only a hollow, breathless fear. He was about to shatter 6 decades of disciplined silence, to poke a sleeping dragon with a stick. His thumb, calloused and aged, hovered over the last digit. Taking a sharp, shallow breath, he pressed it. The ringing on the other end was an intrusion, a violation of some sacred unspoken pact. Once. Twice. He almost hung up, the instinct for self-preservation a screaming siren in his mind. Then, a click and a voice, younger than he expected, sharp and alert. Sarah Klein. The sound of her voice, so immediate and real, locked the air in his lungs. For a long second, there was only the hum of the open line and the roar of his own blood in his ears. He had to force the words out, his own voice a dry, rusted thing. He did not give his name. Instead, he spoke of the Arctic, of the recent news reports, his sentences short, clipped, and deliberately vague. He hinted at a past event, a classified mission from another era, suggesting a direct, terrifying correlation to the anomalies now lighting up modern radar screens. He spoke of a cover-up, of records erased, of men silenced. He could feel her attention sharpen on the other end of the line, the quality of her silence changing from casual reception to focused intensity. She asked a question, her tone careful, probing but not pushing. She was a professional. She knew how to handle a scared source. Jack's grip on the phone tightened, his knuckles bleaching white. He was standing on the edge of a precipice, and her voice was the only thing tethering him to solid ground. He parried her questions with more hints, building a cage of implication around the truth, without yet revealing the beast inside. He was testing her, probing for any sign of dismissal, or, worse, a hidden agenda. Finally, he took the plunge. He proposed a meeting. Neutral ground. A public place where they could talk, where he could show her something, a tattered yellowed flight log he had smuggled out, the only physical proof he had left from that day. The silence that followed his suggestion was the most agonizing of the entire call. He could almost hear the calculations whirring behind her eyes, the assessment of risk and reward. When she agreed, her voice a low, steady agreement, a jolt, equal parts relief and sheer terror, shot through him. He gave her the name of a quiet, out-of-the-way cafe in a neighboring town, and a time 2 days from now. Then, without another word, he ended the call, the click of the receiver sounding like the cocking of a gun. He sat there for a long time, the phone still clutched in his hand, the silence of the room rushing back in, now thick and heavy with consequence. He had just thrown a stone into a still pond, and he had no idea how far the ripples would travel, or what monsters they might wake from the deep. The first call had been made. The line had been crossed. There was no going back. The sterile, windowless room smelled of stale coffee, nervous sweat, and the faint metallic tang of ozone from the humming overhead lights. It was a scent Captain Jack Morrison would forever associate with the moment his world narrowed to a single chilling point on a map. The transition from the present's crushing dread to the past tense anticipation was not a gentle fade but a violent lurch, pulling him from his quiet Arizona kitchen back into the starched collar of his flight suit, the weight of his captain's bars, solid and real on his shoulders. He stood at attention, the crisp fabric of his uniform rustling with his steady, controlled breaths. To his left was Mike, his co-pilot, a man built like a linebacker with a deceptively easy grin that was now conspicuously absent. His jaw was clenched tight, a muscle twitching near his temple. To his right was Dave, their navigator, a lean, intellectual figure whose fingers were usually dancing with restless energy but were now still and clasped tightly behind his back. The three of them formed a silent, rigid line before a large blank map of the Arctic Circle pinned to a felt board. The door hissed open and Colonel James Thorne entered, a man whose presence seemed to suck the very air from the room. He moved with a predator's grace, his uniform immaculate, his eyes the color of chipped flint. He did not greet them. He simply placed a sealed folder on the small metal table before them, the sound a sharp crack in the silence. "Gentlemen," Thorne's voice was low, devoid of inflection, a tool for transmitting information, not emotion. "As of 0400 hours, you are on a Zulu-level priority mission. This briefing, this room, and the contents of this folder do not exist." His gaze swept over them, a physical weight ensuring the message was seared into their minds. He broke the seal on the folder, revealing grainy black and white photographs of Soviet ice stations and complex signal diagrams. The mission was reconnaissance, a high-altitude listening run deep into contested airspace, skirting the edge of the Soviet Arctic. Their objective was to monitor for new, unusual radio signals, a vague directive that immediately set Jack's instincts humming. They were to fly a modified aircraft from a remote, ice-locked base in Greenland, a place so secret it was not marked on any official chart. Thorne's pointer tapped on a specific grid coordinate over the frozen sea. This is your primary listening post. You will loiter, you will listen, and you will record everything. Your eyes and your instruments are our only window. Then came the protocols, delivered with a cold, surgical precision that brooked no misunderstanding. Absolute radio silence was to be maintained from the moment their wheels left the tarmac. No transmissions, not even in the event of an emergency, unless it was a code word situation that meant the complete loss of the aircraft. But it was the final directive that sent a cold trickle of unease down Jack's spine. Thorne's eyes locked with his. You are to report any anomaly, any deviation from expected readings. Any visual or instrumental phenomenon that cannot be immediately and rationally explained by known atmospheric, geological, or man-made sources. Is that clear? The words hung in the air, heavy and ambiguous. Anomaly. It was a word that covered everything from a strange cloud to a hole in the sky. Jack felt Mike shift his weight beside him, a barely perceptible movement of shared discomfort. Dave, ever the book. Scientist seemed to lean forward slightly, his analytical mind already chewing on the implications. Reporting an anomaly was one thing. Defining it in the stark, infinite whiteness of the Arctic was another. Thorne closed the folder, the meeting clearly over. Your aircraft is being prepped. Wheels up at 2200. Dismissed. He turned and left as silently as he had arrived, leaving the three men standing in the humming silence, the ghost of the word anomaly echoing in the sterile air, a seed of dread planted deep in the frozen ground of their orders. The hangar was a cathedral of shadows and echoes, a vast, frigid space carved into the side of a Greenlandic mountain where the air itself tasted of iron and jet fuel. In its center, bathed in the stark, unforgiving glare of work lights, stood their aircraft. It was a U-2, but unlike any Jack had ever piloted. The modifications were immediately apparent, a surgeon's work on a bird of prey. The wings, already impossibly long and graceful, seemed to have been extended further, their leading edges studded with an array of unfamiliar blister-like pods that housed sensors far beyond standard issue. The fuselage was sleeker, its silver skin interrupted by panels of a darker non-reflective material, and the cockpit canopy was tinted almost black, a one-way mirror facing the heavens. It was not just a reconnaissance plane, it was a specialized instrument built for a single secret purpose, and its silent, predatory form filled the hangar with a palpable sense of intent. Jack ran a hand along the cold metal of the fuselage, feeling the subtle hum of pre-flight systems checks vibrating through his fingertips. Mike was already conducting his own walk-around, his movements economical and precise. But his usual easy banter was absent, replaced by a grim focus. He tapped one of the sensor pods, his knuckles rapping a hollow, questioning sound against the housing. Dave, meanwhile, was a whirlwind of activity, climbing in and out of the cramped navigator station behind the cockpit, his face illuminated by the soft green glow of newly installed scopes and monitors. He traced the lines of unfamiliar wiring with a reverent yet anxious touch, muttering to himself about signal processing rates and thermal resolution that defied the technology of the era. The crew's dynamic, usually a well-oiled machine of mutual trust and shared dark humor, was strained, stretched thin over the unspoken unease that had followed them from the briefing room. Mike's silence was a wall, his broad back turned, as he checked landing gear with a force that seemed unnecessary. He was a man of clear orders and defined enemies, and the vagueness of their objective grated against his very nature. Dave's nervous energy, by contrast, was a live wire, his scientific curiosity at war with a deep-seated fear of the unknown. He kept shooting glances at Jack, his eyes wide with unasked questions about the capabilities of their strange aircraft and the true nature of the anomalies they were seeking. Jack felt the tension coiling in the hangar air, thick enough to taste. It was more than just pre-flight jitters. It was the specific chilling disquiet of men who knew they were being sent into the dark with a candle, told to describe the monster without being told what a monster looked like. The aircraft itself was a question mark, its advanced, almost alien technology hinting at a threat profile the brass had not seen fit to share. The remote base, a cluster of Quonset huts huddled against the endless ice, felt less like a sanctuary and more like a cage, isolating them from the world they were supposed to be protecting. As the ground crew began the final preparations, the low rumble of a fuel truck echoing in the vast space, Jack took a moment to look at his crew. Mike, the rock, now looking brittle. Dave, the mind, looking overwhelmed. He sensed the underlying tension not just between them, but radiating from the very really road mission itself. They were pawns on a chessboard they couldn't see. Their aircraft a specialized probe sent to poke at something in the dark. The vague objectives were not an oversight. They felt like a deliberate shield, protecting those who had given the orders from the full, terrifying truth of what they might find. Standing there in the shadow of the modified U-2, under the watchful eyes of the silent ground crew, Jack felt a cold certainty settle in his gut. They were not just flying into hostile airspace, they were flying into the unknown. And the greatest threat might not be the Soviets waiting beyond the ice, but the silent waiting thing their own commanders had sent them to find. The modified U-2 tore down the makeshift runway, its powerful engine a throaty roar that shattered the profound silence of the Arctic night. The landing gear lifted with a solid thump, and the world fell away, replaced by a vast star-dusted blackness below and an infinite cold void above. Jack felt the familiar yet forever unnerving sensation of the aircraft becoming a creature of the sky, its long, sensitive wings biting into the thin, frigid air. The lights of the remote base dwindled to a single, insignificant pinprick of yellow before being swallowed completely by the impenetrable darkness. They were alone now, a tiny, pressurized capsule adrift in a sea of hostile emptiness. Inside the cockpit, the initial silence was thick, charged with the adrenaline of takeoff and the weight of their unspoken fears. Then Mike, strapped into the co-pilot seat, broke it with a forced gruff comment about the base coffee, a weak attempt at their old, easy banter. Dave, from his navigator station, responded with a strained chuckle and a mumbled observation about the clarity of the stars, his voice tinny through the intercom. The words were familiar, the rhythms of their professional camaraderie, but the undertone was all wrong. The humor was brittle, the observations hollow. Their conversation was a fragile shield, a desperate performance of normalcy to mask the raw nerve of their shared nervousness. Each joke was a little too loud, each pause a little too long, betraying the tension that hummed just beneath the surface of their professional composure. Jack kept his hands light on the controls, his eyes constantly scanning the instrument panel, a galaxy of glowing dials and needles that reported a world of data he could not see. They were entering the officially designated hostile airspace, a line on a map that felt terrifyingly abstract out here in the featureless dark. His senses were heightened, every flicker of a gauge, every subtle shift in the engine's pitch, noted and cataloged. The banter of his crew faded into a background hum as he focused outward, his pilot's intuition prickling. It was then that he began to notice the sky itself was wrong. At first, it was subtle. The aurora borealis, a common enough sight, was not its usual graceful curtain of shimmering light. Instead, it churned. Great, ragged bands of emerald and violet twisted in the heavens, not with a gentle dance, but with a violent, convulsive energy, like plasma in a malfunctioning reactor. They pulsed with an irregular, sickly rhythm, casting a lurid, shifting glow across the wingtips that felt invasive. not beautiful. Beyond the aurora, the stars did not twinkle. They bled, their sharp points of light smearing into short, faint trails as if seen through disturbed water. Then came the clouds below. They were not the flat, featureless sheet of stratus typical of the region. They formed a chaotic, rolling landscape of towering cumulonimbus, their peaks lit from within by silent, sporadic flashes of light that were the wrong color, a deep, electric magenta that left ghostly afterimagings on Jack's retinas. There was no thunder, only that deep, unsettling silence, making the light show feel like a pantomime of a storm, a silent, malevolent display. The air itself felt different. The aircraft occasionally hit pockets of turbulence that were not bumps, but strange, viscous lurches, as if they were flying through patches of thickened, resistant atmosphere. Jack said nothing, his jaw tight. He watched the aberrant aurora and the silently screaming clouds, his knuckles white on the control yoke. This was not a weather pattern. This was a symptom. The strange atmospheric conditions were a veil, and behind it he could feel a presence, a vast and waking pressure that was bending the very fabric of the world around them. The crew's nervous banter had died away completely now, leaving only the hum of the engines and the silent screaming evidence outside the canopy that they were flying into something far more hostile than any Soviet air defense network. They were crossing a threshold not just geographical, but existential, and the sky itself was recoiling from what lay ahead. The first sign was not a blip, but a bloom. On the thermal imaging scope to Jack's right, a patch of the frozen sea below, a place that should have been a uniform, deep blue of sub-zero temperatures, suddenly erupted in a violent, incandescent white. It was not the small, defined signature of a submarine or a hidden base, but a sprawling, amorphous stain of heat, vast enough to encompass a small city. It pulsed, not with the steady rhythm of a machine, but with an irregular, organic cadence, like the slow, monstrous heartbeat of the planet itself. Jack's eyes snapped from the unsettling sky to the impossible reading, his breath catching in his throat. Before he could speak, Dave's voice cut through the intercom, sharp and stripped of its usual academic calm. "Captain, magnetic field sensors are going haywire." The needles on the old analog compasses were spinning lazily, uselessly, while the digital readouts flickered with numbers that made no sense. It's generating a field of its own, a massive one, and it's moving. The awe in his voice was rapidly curdling into terror. It's moving due west, Jack, against the planetary rotation, against the flow of the polar currents. That's not possible. Nothing on Earth has that kind of power. Nothing we've ever made, nothing in nature. The tension in the cockpit, already a taut wire, snapped. Mike, who had been staring out at the convulsing aurora, wrenched his gaze inside. What is it? A Soviet drill? Some new kind of engine? His voice was a low growl, seeking a tangible human enemy to focus on, a threat that could be outflown or outgunned. Dave's response was a frantic torrent of denials. No. The thermal output is orders of magnitude beyond any reactor we know of. It's not mechanical, not chemical. The energy signature, it's coherent, but it doesn't match any known profile. It's reading like a living system. And the movement, it's defying physics. To move a mass that large, generating that much heat against the geomagnetic flow, the energy required it's astronomical. It would tear the crust apart. His words painted a picture not of technology, but of a force of nature so profound it rewrote the laws of the universe around it. Jack watched the two men, the rock and the mind, both crumbling under the weight of the impossible. Mike's face was a mask of stubborn denial, his fists clenched as if he could physically fight the data on the screens. Dave was pale, his fingers flying over his console, running and rerunning diagnostics, each confirmation of the readings deepening the lines of panic on his face. The initial shock gave way to a frantic, hushed debate. Mike argued for a malfunction, a cascade of instrument failures induced by the strange atmospheric conditions. Dave countered with cold, hard logic, pointing out the cross-reference data from 3 separate redundant systems, all telling the same terrifying story. The argument escalated, their voices tight and strained in the confined space. It was no longer a professional discussion. It was the sound of 2 worldviews shattering. Mike clung to the familiar paranoia of the Cold War, a world of human adversaries and technological espionage. Dave was being dragged into a darker, vaster unknown, where the rules of his beloved science no longer applied. The heat signature on the scope continued its slow, impossible journey, a silent, monstrous truth gliding effortlessly beneath a mile of ancient ice. The cockpit, once a bastion of human control and precision, now felt like a paper boat on the edge of a maelstrom, and the escalating tension between his crew was merely the first crack in its fragile hull. They were no longer hunters. They were witnesses to an awakening, and the sheer scale of the anomaly was crushing their capacity to even comprehend what they had found. The impossible data on the scopes was no longer a subject for debate. It was a presence in the cockpit, a 4th, silent passenger, whose weight pressed down on them all. The argument between Mike and Dave had dissolved into a taut, breathless silence, broken only by the hum of the engines and the frantic, useless spinning of the magnetic compass. Jack's gaze remained fixed on the thermal display, watching the colossal, pulsing white bloom continue its inexorable, unnatural drift. Every instinct honed by years of command, every fiber of his being as a pilot and an explorer screamed at him to understand, to see. The orders from Colonel Thorne echoed in his mind, cold and rigid. Report any anomaly. But to simply report this, to turn away from the greatest mystery ever to cross their path, felt like a profound cosmic cowardice. He took a slow, measured breath, the air in his oxygen mask casing of rubber in his own fear. "We're going down," Jack said, his voice low but firm, cutting through the static-filled silence. "A controlled descent. 5,000 feet. I want a visual." The reaction was immediate and violent. Mike swiveled in his seat, his face a thundercloud of disbelief. "Jack, no, that's a direct violation. Our orders are to observe and report, not to engage. We don't know what that is. It could be a weapon, a trap. Descending is suicide." His words were laced with the rigid doctrine of the Cold War, where every unknown was a Soviet trick, every risk a potential international incident. He gestured wildly at the still churning, magentic-lit clouds outside. "Look at the sky, for God's sake! The instruments are failing. We lose any more altitude in this soup, we might not get it back." From the navigator station, Dave's voice, though trembling, held a different tone, a desperate, burning curiosity. "He's right, Mike. We have to see. This changes everything. The physics, the energy. Reporting this as a blip on a scope would be a crime. We are the only eyes on this. If we turn back now, they'll bury it. They'll call it a glitch, just like they'll want to." His support was not reckless, but born from a scientist's agonizing need for truth. A conviction that some mysteries were too important to be left to the shadows of protocol. Jack felt the moral dilemma tear at him, a schism between duty and discovery. Mike represented the world of chain of command and paranoid certainty, where survival meant following the rules laid down by men in safe rooms far from the ice. Dave represented the relentless human drive to know, to push beyond the boundaries of the mapped world, even at the risk of what might be found there. And Jack was trapped in the middle, the captain whose decision would seal all their fates. The Cold War paranoia was a cage, and the thing below the ice was the key. But using it might unlock a door that could never be closed again. To descend was to defy not just orders, but the very ethos of secrecy that had defined their lives. It was to choose the terrifying possibility of truth over the safe certainty of the lie they had been sent to live. He looked at Mike, whose jaw was set in a hard line of betrayal, and then at Dave, whose eyes pleaded from the glowing green darkness of his station. The weight of the decision was an anvil on his chest. He was choosing between the safety of his crew and the salvation of his own conscience, between the known terrors of court-martial and the unknown terror waiting beneath the storm. His hand tightened on the control yoke, feeling the aircraft respond to his slightest intention. The argument was over. The decision was his alone. With a slow, deliberate motion, he began to push the yoke forward, initiating the descent into the swirling, unnatural light. They were going down. The nose of the U-2 dipped, a deliberate and irrevocable surrender to gravity and curiosity. For a heart-stopping moment, the descent was smooth, a controlled slide into the churning, magenta-lit abyss. Then the sky broke its silence. A violent, jarring shudder racked the aircraft, a deep, resonant tremor that felt less like turbulence and more like the world itself was cracking apart. The control yoke bucked in Jack's hands, fighting him with a will of its own as the modified wings designed for the serene thinness of the stratosphere groaned in protest against the thickened hostile air. The instrument panel erupted into a frantic dance of warning lights, needles swinging wildly across their dials as if trying to escape the reality they were reporting. Outside the canopy, the world dissolved into a maelstrom of impossible light. The convulsing aurora was gone, replaced by something far more intimate and terrifying. Eerie, phosphorescent tendrils of green and blue light, like living veins of electricity, snaked through the storm clouds, flickering with a chaotic strobing rhythm that had no relation to any natural phenomenon. They pulsed around the aircraft, illuminating the cockpit in stark, intermittent flashes, casting long, dancing shadows across the terrified faces of the crew. The light did not illuminate the clouds. It seemed to bleed from within them, a sickly alien luminescence that pulsed in time to the violent shaking of the fuselage. It was a light that felt sentient, a malevolent gaze fixed upon their tiny, intruding vessel. Jack's entire world narrowed to the fight in his hands. Every muscle in his arms and shoulders strained against the yoke, his knuckles bone white as he fought to keep the aircraft level. His movements were small, precise corrections, a desperate ballet against an invisible, overwhelming force that sought to twist them into a fatal spin. The altimeter was unwinding at an alarming rate, the numbers blurring as they plunged deeper into the storm. He could feel the G-forces pressing down on him, a heavy hand trying to crush him into his seat. His breath came in ragged gasps, the oxygen mask feeling like a suffocating hand over his mouth. He was a pilot at the edge of his envelope, his skill and the aircraft's integrity the only fragile threads holding them between the chaotic sky and the unyielding ice miles below. In the sicket of their inerpre and didn't agnonis co-pilot's seat, Mike was a statue of rigid terror, his hands braced against the instrument panel, his face a pale mask in the strobing light. His eyes were wide, fixed on the chaos outside, all arguments and protocol forgotten in the primal face of the storm. From the navigator's station, Dave's frantic muttering had ceased, replaced by a choked, silent horror. The scopes before him were a mess of frantic, nonsensical data. The anomaly they had sought now a palpable physical force tearing at their aircraft. The fear in the cockpit was a thick, suffocating fog, stealing the air from their lungs and the coherence from their thoughts. It was no longer a fear of court-martial or Soviet missiles. It was a deeper, more ancient terror, the fear of being a tiny, fragile thing in the maw of something vast, unknowable, and utterly enraged by their presence. The descent was no longer a choice. It was a fall, and the mounting dread of the crew was the only sound louder than the screaming wind and the groaning airframe. The world did not so much end as it was erased. One moment, the cockpit was a cacophony of shrieking alarms, groaning metal, and the frantic, panicked breaths of three men. The next, it was swallowed by an absolute, suffocating void. The violent shuddering ceased so abruptly it felt like a physical blow, leaving behind a stillness so profound it seemed to have its own weight, its own pressure. The instrument panel. A moment ago, a frantic constellation of red and amber warnings went black. Every single light, every dial, every glowing screen died at once, plunging the cockpit into a darkness broken only by the faint, sickly green of the phantom lights still flickering impotently outside the canopy. Then came the sound, or rather, the replacement of all sound. A deafening, all-consuming static roared from the radio headsets, a white noise avalanche that held no signal, no pattern, no hope of a human voice. It was the sound of emptiness given voice, a shriek of pure entropy that filled their ears and their skulls, drowning out all thought. Jack ripped the headset from his ears, but the static did not diminish. It was in the air itself, a palpable vibration that hummed through the aircraft's frame and resonated in the fillings of their teeth. It was the sound of the universe being unmade, and they were trapped at its epicenter. Jack's hands, still gripping the control yoke, felt nothing. The hydraulics were dead. The yoke moved with a sickening loose lightness, disconnected from the control surfaces, from the world. The aircraft was no longer a machine. It was a husk, a leaf caught in a current they could not see or fight. He scanned the dead panel, his pilot's mind desperately seeking a flicker of life, a backup system, anything. There was nothing. The artificial horizon was a frozen black disk. The altimeter was a blind eye. The compass spun in a lazy, meaningless circle. They were flying blind, deaf and dumb, utterly divorced from any reference point in the known world. He turned his head, the movement slow and heavy in the oppressive stillness. Mike was staring straight ahead, his face a ghastly pale oval in the gloom, his mouth slightly agape. His hands were frozen on his own dead controls, his knuckles locked. Dave, in the navigator station, was a shadow frantically tapping at black screens, his movements becoming more and more desperate, more useless, until they slowed and stopped altogether. He slumped back in his seat, his head leaning against the cold glass of the canopy, his eyes wide with a terror that had moved beyond panic into a silent catatonic horror. The realization of their isolation crashed down upon them with a force greater than any turbulence. They were not just off the grid. They had been severed from it. No one at the remote base could hear them. No satellite could see them. No instrument could testify to their existence. They were a ghost in the machine of the world, a secret that the Arctic itself was now keeping. The radio static was not an absence of communication. It was a wall, a barrier that had fallen between them and the rest of humanity. They were completely, utterly alone, adrift in a silent, lightless sea with a leviathan they could not see. The panic that had been mounting now peaked, not in screams, but in this terrible shared silence, the profound, gut-wrenching understanding of their absolute and total vulnerability. They were prey, suspended in the lair of a predator whose nature they could not comprehend, and the only sound was the endless, mocking hiss of their own oblivion. The silence did not break. It was torn. The oppressive, static-filled void that had gripped the cockpit was suddenly ripped apart by a low, resonant hum that seemed to originate not from outside the aircraft, but from deep within the bones of the world. It was a vibration that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the primal core of the brain, a frequency of pure, ancient power. The eerie phosphorescent lights that had been flickering chaotically in the clouds began to coalesce, their random dance snapping into a terrifying unified purpose. They swirled inward, drawing together like iron filings to a magnet converging on a single point directly ahead of the drifting aircraft. Then, the clouds parted. It was not the work of wind or weather, but a deliberate geometric withdrawal, as if a colossal, invisible curtain was being drawn back on a stage not meant for human eyes. And from that parting veil, it rose. A structure of such immense scale that the mind recoiled, struggling to find a reference point for its sheer size. It was not a ship, not a building, not anything born of human geometry or understanding. It was a colossal, pulsating lattice of unearthly light, a city-sized architecture of interlocking, crystalline forms that seemed to be both solid and ethereal at once. Its surface was a living skin of shifting molten color deep indigos bled into, searing magentas which cooled into venomous greens, all pulsing with that same slow, rhythmic cadence they had seen on their scopes, the monstrous heartbeat given form. The light it emitted was not illumination. It was a substance. It poured from the structure in thick, visible waves, pushing back the darkness of the storm and the night, casting a stark, otherworldly radiance across the underside of the U-2's wings. This was the source. This was the anomaly. The sheer silent grandeur of it dominated the sky, reducing the vast Arctic expanse to a mere frame for its terrifying presence. It hung there, a silent, pulsating god in a cathedral of cloud and ice, its humming resonance the only liturgy. Inside the cockpit, the three men were paralyzed, not by the failure of their machines, but by the utter failure of their reality. Mike's rigid posture of terror melted away into a slack-jawed, wide-eyed stupor, his mind simply refusing to process the scale of the thing before him. His hands fell from the dead controls into his lap, limp and useless. Dave, who had sought answers in data and logic, let out a soft, choked sound that was half a whimper, half a prayer. The scientist in him was annihilated, replaced by a primitive, awe-stricken fear. He stared, unblinking, as the structure's light played across his face, his theories of impossible physics rendered pathetic and small in the face of this living, breathing impossibility. Jack felt his own breath freeze in his lungs. Every nightmare, every haunted memory of the last 60 years was a pale, faded photograph compared to the vivid, horrifying reality now before him. The pulsating light, the resonant hum, it was all exactly as he remembered, yet infinitely more terrifying in its tangible presence. This was no hallucination, no atmospheric trick. It was a thing, an entity of immense power and unknowable purpose, and they were floating before it like a gnat before a star. The terror was not just of death, but of insignificance. They were witnesses to a truth so vast it threatened to erase them, and in that moment, paralyzed in their dead aircraft, before the colossal glowing Leviathan, they were utterly and completely dominated by a fear as old as life itself, the fear of a predator whose gaze had finally, after 60 years, found them again. The primal terror that held them in its icy grip was shattered by a single desperate instinct, the will to survive. Jack's hands, which had been frozen on the dead controls, moved. It was not a conscious thought, but a raw physical reaction, a rebellion against the awe-inspiring horror that filled the sky. He slammed his palm against the primary power bus, then the secondary, his movements frantic, a prayer in the form of action. Nothing. The panel remained a dark, silent void. Then his fingers found the manual override for the auxiliary generator, a last resort system meant for catastrophic electrical failure. He threw the switch, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. For a long, agonizing second, nothing happened. Then, a single weak light flickered on the panel, the analog gyroscope, a purely mechanical device, spun to life. It was not much, but it was a reference point, a sliver of the known world in the sea of the impossible. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, he hauled back on the control yoke, no longer fighting the chaotic air, but fighting the dead weight of the aircraft itself. The nose, which had been drifting downward, began to rise with a groaning, painful slowness. The engines, starved of computer guidance, sputtered and coughed, then caught with a ragged, protesting roar that was the most beautiful sound Jack had ever heard. They began to climb, the aircraft shaking violently as it fought for altitude, a wounded bird struggling to escape a cage of light. Jack did not look back. He kept his eyes fixed on the feeble glow of the gyroscope, his entire being focused on the simple, sacred act of climbing away. The pulsating green radiance that had filled the cockpit began to recede, the oppressive hum fading from a physical vibration to a distant, ominous thrum. In his peripheral vision, he could see the colossal structure beginning to diminish, its terrifying geometry shrinking back into the chaotic clouds from which it had emerged, as if the Arctic itself was drawing a veil over its secret once more. It did not vanish so much as it was absorbed, the light dying until only the natural hostile darkness of the polar night remained. The relief that washed over them was a physical warmth, a sudden, dizzying influx of oxygen into lungs that had forgotten how to breathe. Mike let out a choked, shuddering sob, his hands coming up to cover his face. Dave was hyperventilating, his breaths coming in sharp, ragged gasps as he stared at the now empty sky ahead. But the relief was poison, short-lived and corrosive. As the immediate threat receded, the trauma rushed in to fill the void it left behind. The silence in the cockpit was no longer one of static, but of shock, a heavy, shared understanding of something that could never be unseen. Their hands still trembled. Their hearts still raced, but now it's the aftershock of a psychic earthquake. They exchanged no words, no glances of shared survival. Instead, each man retreated into the fortress of his own mind. The images of the pulsating leviathan seared onto the backs of their eyelids. And that silent, shuddering climb back towards a world that could never be the same. A vow was made, unspoken, but binding. They would never speak of it, not to their commanders, not to their wives, not to each other. The truth of what they had witnessed was a burden too terrible to share, a ghost they would now carry alone, forever haunting the quiet spaces of their lives. The sterile, windowless room at the remote base felt like a decompression chamber, locking away the vast, terrifying truth of the Arctic sky and replacing it with the small, suffocating reality of fluorescent lights and government-issue gray carpet. The transition from the shuddering, adrenaline-fueled flight back to this rigid earthbound silence was a shock to Jack's system. Mike and Dave sat in a row of hardback chairs, their flight suits still smelling of cold sweat and fear, their bodies vibrating with the phantom tremors of their dead aircraft. The relief of survival had curdled into a numb, hollow dread. They were no longer pilots who had cheated death. They were witnesses who had seen something they were never meant to see, and now they had to account for it. The door opened, and two men entered, their movements synchronized and silent. They were not military, not in any way, Jack recognized. Their suits were a dark, unremarkable charcoal, their faces devoid of expression, their eyes like polished stones that absorbed light but gave nothing back. They carried no folders, no notepads. They simply took seats opposite the crew, their presence an immediate chilling negation of the world the three men had just escaped. One of them, a man with thinning hair and a voice as dry as dust, did the talking. He began not with questions, but with statements. He described their flight path, their altitude, the brief period of instrument failure which he attributed to a documented high-altitude electrical storm. He spoke of the known psychological effects of prolonged Arctic missions, isolation, sensory deprivation, the hypnotic effect of the aurora. He painted a picture of a routine, if challenging flight that had been compromised by environmental factors and human fallibility. He never once mentioned the structure, the light, the hum. When Jack tried to speak, to describe the colossal living geometry that had risen from the clouds, the man listened with a polite, detached silence, then dismissed it with a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "Spatial disorientation, Captain Morrison," he said, his tone flat, "and final. A well-documented phenomenon. The storm clouds, the unusual auroral activity, your brains, under duress, attempted to create a coherent narrative from chaotic sensory input. A shared hallucination. It's more common than you think." He turned his placid gaze to Mike and Dave, who sat in stunned silence. "Your instruments failed? Your minds filled in the blanks. There is no shame in it." The argument was a silent scream in Jack's throat. He looked at Mike, who stared at his own hands, his face a mask of shame and confusion. He looked at Dave, who opened his mouth to protest with scientific fact, but under the man's flat, unwavering gaze, the words died before they were born. The officials were not debating, they were reprogramming. They systematically dismantled their experience, piece by terrifying piece, labeling each one as a flaw in perception, a glitch in the machine, a trick of the light. They confiscated everything, the flight logs, the maintenance reports, the personal notes Dave had scribbled in a moment of frantic analysis. They took the data, the evidence, and their dignity, leaving them with only the disorienting echo of their own officially invalidated terror. As the men stood to leave, their work complete, the one who had spoken finally looked directly at Jack. There was no malice in his eyes, no threat. There was nothing at all. The mission is classified. Your experience as you described it did not happen. It is in the best interest of national security and your own futures that you accept this." Then they were gone, leaving the three men in the humming silence. Jack sat there, the cold from the metal chair seeping through his flight suit. The seed of a new and terrifying understanding was planted deep within him. Its first tendril of growth, a cold, sharp spike of distrust. It wasn't just that they were lying. It was the effortless, institutional perfection of the lie. They hadn't just covered up an anomaly. They had erased it, and in doing so, they had erased a part of him. The system he had sworn to protect, the chain of command he had revered, was not a shield. It was a veil, and he had just seen the first chilling glimpse of the vast, indifferent machinery that operated behind it. The real terror was no longer in the Arctic sky. It was here, in this quiet room, in the calm, certain eyes of men who could unmake the truth with a few soft-spoken words. The quiet cafe was a sanctuary of mundane sounds, the gentle hiss of the espresso machine, the soft clink of porcelain, the low murmur of other patrons' conversations. It was a world of comforting normalcy, a world Jack Morrison had spent 60 years trying to inhabit. But as he sat across from Sarah Klein, the steam from his untouched coffee curling into the space between them, he felt the fragile walls of that world crumble. The weight he had carried for a lifetime was no longer a solitary burden. It was a presence at the table, a ghost demanding to be heard. His hands, resting on the scarred wooden surface, betrayed him. A faint, constant tremor shook them, a physical echo of the internal earthquake that had begun the moment he decided to make the call. He watched the ripples dance across the dark surface of his coffee, a miniature storm in a cup, and knew he could no longer hold the tide back. He began to speak, his voice a low, gravelly thing, stripped of the bravado of a retired captain, and filled instead with the raw vulnerability of an old man unburdening his soul. He did not start with the anomaly, the light, or the terror. He started with the aftermath. He described the return to the base, the grim, silent flight back, the way the three of them had moved like sleepwalkers, their shared experience a chasm of unspeakable horror between them. Then he told her about the debriefing, the men in their dark suits, their eyes like polished stones, the calm, methodical dismantling of their reality. He recounted the official verdict shared. Hallucination, spatial disorientation, high-altitude psychosis. The words, even now, tasted like ash in his mouth. His voice grew thicker, choked with an emotion that was equal parts grief and a rage that had been simmering for 6 decades. He described the erasure. How the mission logs, the instrument tapes, the official records, every piece of paper that testified to their flight and their findings were confiscated, and he was certain destroyed. How their aircraft, the specially modified U-2, was quietly decommissioned and scrapped within weeks. How they were each pulled aside for individual, supportive conversations that were, in reality, veiled threats wrapped in the language of patriotic duty and concern for their mental well-being. He looked at Sarah, his eyes glistening with the unshed tears of a lifetime of enforced silence. "They didn't just cover it up," he whispered, the words raw. "They scrubbed it. They took a truth so vast it could have changed everything we know about our world, and they treated it like a stain. They made us complicit in our own silencing." His hands shook more violently now, and he clasped them together to still them, a futile gesture. He was not just recounting history. He was reliving the profound, soul-crushing moment when he realized that the institution he had given his life to was built on a foundation of lies, and that his duty was to become a guardian of that lie. The weight of the secret was not just the memory of the thing in the ice. It was the crushing guilt of having helped bury it, of having lived a long life in the long, cold shadow of a truth he was forbidden to speak. The quiet cafe was a sanctuary of mundane sounds. The gentle hiss of the espresso machine, the soft clink of porcelain, the low murmur of other patrons' conversations. It was a world of comforting normalcy. A world Jack Morrison had spent 60 years trying to inhabit. But as he sat across from Sarah Klein, the steam from his untouched coffee curling into the space between them, He felt the fragile walls of that world crumble. The weight he had carried for a lifetime was no longer a solitary burden. It was a presence at the table, a ghost demanding to be heard. His hands, resting on the scarred wooden surface, betrayed him. A faint, constant tremor shook them, a physical echo of the internal earthquake that had begun the moment he decided to make the call. He watched the ripples dance across the dark surface of his coffee, a miniature storm in a cup, and knew he could no longer hold the tide back. He began to speak, his voice a low, gravelly thing, stripped of the bravado of a retired captain, and filled instead with the raw vulnerability of an old man unburdening his soul. He did not start with the anomaly, the light, or the terror. He started with the aftermath. He described the return to the base, the grim, silent flight back, the way the three of them had moved like sleepwalkers, their shared experience a chasm of unspeakable horror between them. Then he told her about the debriefing. The men in their dark suits, their eyes like polished stones, the calm, methodical dismantling of their reality. He recounted the official verdict: shared hallucination, spatial disorientation, high-altitude psychosis. The words, even now, tasted like ash in his mouth. His voice grew thicker, choked with an emotion that was equal parts grief and a rage that had been simmering for 6 decades. He described the erasure, how the mission logs, the instrument tapes, the official records, every piece of paper that testified to their flight and their findings were confiscated and, he was certain, destroyed. How their aircraft, the specially modified U-2, was quietly decommissioned and scrapped within weeks. How they were each pulled aside for individual, supportive conversations that were, in reality, veiled threats wrapped in the language of patriotic duty and concern for their mental well-being. He looked at Sarah, his eyes glistening with the unshed tears of a lifetime of enforced silence. "They didn't just cover it up," he whispered, the words raw. "They scrubbed it. They took a truth so vast it could have changed everything we know about our world, and they treated it like a stain. They made us complicit in our own silencing." His hands shook more violently now, and he clasped them together to still them, a futile gesture. He was not just recounting history. He was reliving the profound soul-crushing moment when he realized that the institution he had given his life to was built on a foundation of lies, and that his duty was to become a guardian of that lie. The weight of the secret was not just the memory of the thing in the ice, it was the crushing guilt of having helped bury it, of having lived a long life in the long, cold shadow of a truth he was forbidden to speak. The silence in Sarah's small, book-cluttered apartment was a different kind of quiet, charged with the electric hum of a mind at work. After Jack had left the cafe, a shaken man who had poured 60 years of pent-up truth onto the table, Sarah had retreated to her digital fortress. The scent of old paper and ozone from her overworked computers filled the air as she dove into the labyrinth of military archives, her fingers flying across the keyboard with a focused intensity. Jack's story was not just a tale. It was a key, and she was determined to find the lock it fit. The official records, as he had said, were pristine, sterile, and utterly useless. The mission number he'd given her led to a file containing only a single boilerplate entry about a routine atmospheric sampling run, its details so generic they could have applied to 100 different flights. But Sarah was a bloodhound for bureaucratic inconsistencies. She cross-referenced aircraft tail numbers, crew manifests, and base deployment schedules from that era, her screen a mosaic of data points. Slowly, the cracks began to show. The specific U-2 variant Jack described, with its extended wingspan and specialized pods, was listed as undergoing long-term maintenance during the exact week of their flight. The remote Greenlandic base was officially inactive for the entire winter of 1962, according to one declassified logistics report. Yet another document listed a significant unexplained fuel shipment delivered there just days before Jack's mission. Then she found it buried in a digitized cache of decommissioned project code names, a single, oblique reference nestled between Project Skyhook and Project Stargazer. The words were stark on the screen: Project Iceberg, There were no details, no mission statements, no attached files. It was a ghost, a name without a body, but its classification level was higher than anything else in the database. A Zulu-level black hole of information. The date of its inception was listed as November 1962, just weeks after Jack's flight. It was no coincidence. The name itself felt like a taunt, a cold, clinical label for the living, breathing terror Jack had described rising from the ice. She printed out the scant evidence, the conflicting documents, the ghost of Project Iceberg, and arranged the pages on her desk. The inconsistencies formed a pattern, a negative image of the truth. The official silence was not an absence. It was a shape. She called Jack, her voice vibrating with a controlled excitement. She did not tell him everything over the phone, but she gave him enough, the conflicting records, the Phantom Project name. She heard his breath catch on the other end of the line, a sharp, ragged intake of air. It was the sound of validation, of a man who had spent his life being told he was crazy finally being handed a single fragile thread of proof. When they met again, this time in a secluded corner of a public park, she laid the printouts before him. Jack's hands were steadier now as he picked them up, his eyes scanning the dry, bureaucratic language that hinted at the hint. Monstrous reality, he knew. He traced the words Project Iceberg with a trembling finger, his face a canvas of grim satisfaction and renewed dread. The proof was thin, circumstantial, but it was real. It was a crack in the official story. And staring at it, Jack felt something long dormant stir within him, a fierce, burning determination. The weight of the secret was still there, but it was no longer a burden to be carried alone. It was a weapon to be sharpened. The ghost had a name now, and with a name it could be hunted. The air in the assisted living facility was a sterile cocktail of antiseptic and boiled vegetables. A scent that spoke of contained lives and quiet endings. It was a far cry from the crisp ozone and jet fuel atmosphere of the hangar where Jack had last seen Mike as a young, bullish co-pilot. The man who sat in the armchair by the window was a ghost of that figure, his large frame diminished and stooped, the skin of his face loose and pale as parchment. An oxygen tube was tucked under his nose, his breathing a soft, rhythmic whistle. But when Mike's eyes, still a sharp, startling blue, lifted to meet Jack's, a flicker of the old, stubborn fire ignited within them, a fire that was immediately doused by a profound and weary fear. Jack pulled up a chair, the plastic legs scraping softly on the linoleum. He spoke gently, mentioning Sarah, the journalist, the recent anomalies, the cracks they were finding in the official story. He talked about the need for corroboration, for another voice to give weight to his own. He did not mention the pulsating structure or the screaming silence. He did not have to. The mere allusion to that year, that mission, was enough. Mike's gaze, which had been fixed on Jack, slid away, focusing on the sun-bleached lawn outside his window. His hands, resting on the arms of the chair, tightened, the knuckles standing out like white stones. He did not refuse to talk. His silence was a more profound refusal. It was a wall built over 6 decades of disciplined terror. He shook his head slowly, a minute, defeated gesture. His eyes, when they briefly met Jack's again, were pleading, desperate. They were not the eyes of a man who had forgotten, but of a man for whom the memory was a live wire he dared not touch. He gestured vaguely, a trembling hand lifting from the armrest before falling back. The gesture spoke of threats, not shouted, but whispered in quiet rooms by men in dark suits. It spoke of promises made, of a peace purchased with a lifetime of silence, a peace he was too old and too frail to jeopardize now. The encounter was brief, a mere 15 minutes that felt like an eternity of unspoken anguish. As Jack stood the lead, defeated, Mike's hand shot out with a surprising frail strength and gripped his wrist. His grip was cold, the skin papery. He looked up at Jack, his blue eyes blazing with a final urgent intensity. He did not speak, but the message was transmitted through that desperate contact, Silent binding oath. Leave it buried. For your sake. For mine. Swear it? The pressure of his fingers was a brand, searing the old promise back into Jack's soul. Then his hand fell away and he turned back to the window, a fortress once more, his silence complete. Walking back to his car through the overly bright parking lot, Jack felt a deeper chill than any the Arctic had ever inflicted. Mike's terrified silence was more damning than any confession. It was a living testament to the enduring power of the threats that had been made, to the long shadow the men in suits still cast. The encounter did not just fail to gain an ally, it stripped away a piece of his own history, isolating him further. Mike and Dave were gone, one to silence, the other to the grave. He was the last one, the sole keeper of a truth so terrifying it could petrify a man 6 decades later. The visit had been meant to find strength in shared experience, but it had only magnified his solitude, hardening his resolve into a cold, flinty core. He was truly alone now, and the path ahead, lit only by the grim light of his own determination, seemed darker and more dangerous than ever. The data streamed across Sarah's monitor like a digital fever dream, a relentless cascade of numbers and thermal maps that painted a picture of a world waking to a nightmare. The initial Arctic anomaly, the one that had first drawn Jack from his silence, was no longer an isolated event. It was a cancer, metastasizing. New radar feeds hacked from a half-dozen global monitoring stations showed identical energy signatures flaring to life in the most remote, inhospitable places on Earth. A pulse of the same impossible, coherent energy bloomed deep in the Mariana Trench, its thermal stain spreading across the ocean floor. Another ignited in the airless, frozen vacuum of a high-altitude zone over the Antarctic plateau. A third flickered into existence deep within the Amazon basin, a silent, screaming heart of light in the primordial dark. The pattern was undeniable. A synchronized awakening across the planet's most extreme environments, each event a perfect, terrifying echo of the 1962 reading. Sarah sat back, the glow of the screen casting her face in a pale, sickly light. The sheer scale of it was paralyzing. This was not a localized phenomenon to be contained and buried under a Greenlandic glacier. This was global. And as she stared at the map, now dotted with pulsing red points of interest, her mind, trained to find connections in the chaos, began to pull at a different thread. She dove back into the archives, but this time she looked beyond 1962. She searched for other Cold War incidents shrouded in similar silence. Events dismissed as weather balloons, swamp gas, or mass hysteria. She found them. A report from a British Antarctic survey team in 1965 that described a luminous silent object that rose from the ice before vanishing, its members subjected to intense, clandestine debriefs. Declassified CIA memos from the 1970s fretted over a recurring sensor ghosts in the deep Pacific, attributed to Soviet acoustic warfare tests that were never corroborated. A near-identical account from a defected Soviet pilot who spoke of a mission over the Siberian tundra in 1959, of a city of light in the sky and the swift, brutal silencing of his entire squadron upon their return. The details varied, the dates were scattered, but the core narrative was always the same: an encounter with an impossible, non-human intelligence, followed by an immediate, systematic, and total cover-up by the powers that be. It wasn't a series of unrelated incidents. It was a pattern of behavior, a global policy of concealment that transcended national borders and Cold War animosities. The Americans, the Soviets, the British, they weren't competing to understand the phenomenon. They were competing to bury it. The recent simultaneous awakening wasn't a new invasion. It was a cycle. The entity, or entities, emerged, were detected, and were promptly erased from public record, their existence becoming just another dirty secret of the national security state. The cover-ups weren't just about preventing panic. They were a form of containment, a desperate attempt to maintain control over a narrative that was, and always had been, wildly out of control. The pattern was repeating, but this time it was happening everywhere at once, and the old methods of concealment were straining at the seams, unable to contain a truth that was now bursting from the ice, the ocean, and the jungle all at once. The dots were connected, and they formed a picture of a planet being watched, and a humanity that had been systematically blinded to the watchers for generations. The federal building was a monolith of polished granite and tinted glass, a fortress of bureaucracy designed to intimidate and obscure. Jack Morrison, feeling every one of his 78 years, walked beside Sarah Klein through the vast, echoing lobby, their footsteps swallowed by the marble floor. His heart was a frantic bird beating against the cage of his ribs. This was the belly of the beast, the very system that had erased his past and now threatened to silence his future. Sarah moved with a determined grace, her expression neutral, but Jack could see the tension in the set of her shoulders. She had used every contact, called in every favor, to secure this 15-minute window with Deputy Director Evans, a mid-level official in the Department of Defense with a reputation for managing sensitive inquiries. They were ushered into a conference room that was aggressively nondescript beige walls, a synthetic blue carpet, a laminated table that reflected the harsh fluorescent lights. Deputy Director Evans was already there, standing by the window and looking out at a view of another, identical federal building. He was a man in his late 50s, with a carefully cultivated appearance of bland authority, a neat haircut, a dark, off-the-rack suit, a face that gave away nothing. He turned as they entered, offering a smile that didn't reach his eyes, a professional courtesy as thin as the laminate on the table. Sarah did the talking at first, her voice calm and measured. She laid out their case not as wild conspiracy, but as a series of documented inconsistencies. The archived records of Project Iceberg, the conflicting data from 1962, the recent global radar anomalies that mirrored the historical event. She presented it as a puzzle for which Jack Morrison held a key. Evans listened, his hands steepled under his chin. His expression one of polite, detached interest. When Sarah finished, he turned his placid gaze to Jack. Jack spoke then, his voice rougher than he intended. He didn't describe the pulsating structure or the paralyzing fear. He stuck to the facts as he knew them, the mission parameters, the instrument readings, the official denial. He watched Evans's face, searching for a flicker of recognition, a tell, anything. For a moment, he thought he saw it. The slight tightening around the man's eyes when Jack mentioned the specific grid coordinates. A barely perceptible twitch in his left hand, which he quickly stilled by clasping it with his right on the table. It wasn't much, but it was there, a crack in the bland facade. A nervousness that was carefully controlled but undeniably present. Then the denial came, smooth and practiced. Evans expressed sympathy for Captain Morrison, acknowledging the stress of such a long-held belief. He dismissed Project Iceberg as a defunct meteorological study, its classification a simple matter of outdated protocol. The recent anomalies were the result of new, highly sensitive satellite technology misinterpreting complex geothermal and atmospheric data. He spoke in a circle of bland, technical jargon, building a wall of plausible deniability around their entire investigation. There was no conspiracy, no cover-up, only a series of unfortunate misunderstandings and the frailties of human memory over time. As Sarah pressed him on a specific point about the decommissioned U-2, Evans's demeanor shifted subtly. The polite mask didn't slip, but it hardened. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping, losing its bureaucratic warmth and taking on a colder, more direct tone. He didn't threaten them, he didn't have to. He spoke of the importance of national security, of the dangers of public speculation on matters of global stability, of the personal toll that such obsessive pursuits could take on private citizens, especially elderly ones with complicated medical histories. The words were velvet, but the fist inside was plain. He was no longer just denying. He was warning them. The meeting was over. He stood, his smile returning, brittle and final. He wished them well and saw them to the door. His handshake with Jack, a brief cold contact. Out in the hallway, the heavy door clicking shut behind them, felt like the ceiling of a tomb. They walked in silence back through the cavernous lobby, the vague warnings hanging in the air between them, more tangible and threatening than any direct threat could have been. The encounter had yielded no confession, no evidence, only a chilling confirmation. They had looked into the eyes of the system, and the system had looked back, its gaze nervous, its denial absolute, and its capacity for making problems disappear, deeply, terrifyingly implied. The mystery had not been solved. It had been deepened, wrapped in a new layer of official silence and unspoken danger. The scent of stale coffee and old paper was a perfume of revelation in Sarah's dimly lit apartment. The confrontation with Deputy Director Evans had not deterred her. It had ignited a colder, more focused fire. His nervousness, his veiled warnings were not the actions of a man guarding mundane secrets. They were the tells of a keeper standing before a door he feared was about to be blown open. And Sarah had found the key. Not in a government archive, but in the digital ghost of a disgruntled, long-dead systems analyst whose personal files had been carelessly left on a decommissioned server due for wiping. The files were a fragmented, digital corpse, but the bones of the truth were there. Project Iceberg was not a study of weather or Soviet signals. It was, according to the terse clinical language of the internal memos, a permanent global monitoring initiative tasked with tracking non-terrestrial energy signatures of unknown origin. The language was dry, but the implications were seismic. The document spoke of signals that were not just unusual but ancient. Deep core ice sample analyses, referenced in a fragment of a geological report, suggested the energy patterns had been detected in Paleolithic ice layers, their source predating human civilization by hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of years. The entity, or whatever it was, wasn't a visitor. It was a resident, a sleeper in the planetary ice, its cycles of activity measured in epochs, not years. Sarah's breath fogged in the cold air of her apartment as she scrolled, her heart hammering against her ribs. The memos detailed the initial containment protocol established after the 1962 event, Jack's event. It was not a protocol for engagement or study, but for suppression. The primary objective was signal quarantine, the use of powerful ground-based emitters to create a damping field around the active zones, a technological blanket thrown over a crying infant to smother its screams. The files noted with chilling matter-of-factness the catalytic effect of human technological emissions, suggesting that the global spread of radar, radio, and other energy signatures had not merely detected the entity, but were actively stirring it from its long slumber. The cover-up was not just about hiding a truth, it was a desperate attempt to stop poking the bear. She found fragmented notes on behavioral patterns observed during brief, contained emergence events. The entity the document suggested was not a static object, but a cohesive energy-based intelligence that exhibited reactive and adaptive properties. It learned. It responded to the damping fields, its energy signatures shifting, finding new resonant frequencies to bypass the suppression. The attempts at containment were a constant, losing battle, a game of whack-a-mole played with a god. The most chilling note was a single stark line from a status report dated 1988. Subject appears to be using our own monitoring network as a neural pathway. Attempts at signal quarantine may be facilitating, not preventing, its global awareness. They weren't containing it, they were teaching it how to think, how to spread. The hidden files revealed a truth far more terrifying than a simple government cover-up. They revealed a decades-long losing war against an ancient, intelligent force that was slowly, inexorably learning its way out of its icy cage. The clinical language of the files began to curdle, shifting from dry observation to the frantic coded terminology of a losing battle. Sarah's eyes, strained from hours in the screen's glow, widened as she deciphered the next layer of the hidden truth. The entity's disruption of technology was not a mere byproduct of its energy field, it was a targeted, intelligent response. The documents detailed incidents where specific monitoring outposts, those employing new, more advanced scanning techniques, would suffer catastrophic, simultaneous failures the moment their sensors locked onto the anomaly's core signature. It wasn't a blanket electromagnetic pulse, it was a surgical strike, a precise severing of the technological eyes that dared to look too closely. The files used terms like active counter-surveillance and adaptive signal negation, cold phrases that barely contained the terrifying implication. The thing in the ice was not just aware of its observers, it was actively intelligently blinding them. This led to the most damning section of the files, a collection of interagency memos and policy directives that laid bare the global conspiracy. The cover-ups were not ad hoc reactions to individual incidents. They were a meticulously crafted, internationally coordinated policy application. Its sole purpose was to prevent mass panic at any cost. The memos argued, with cold bureaucratic logic, that the revelation of a non-human, intelligent, and technologically dominant force on Earth would shatter the foundations of human society, religion, and governance. Economies would collapse, nations would fracture, and the very concept of human supremacy would be rendered obsolete overnight. The truth was deemed an existential threat to global stability, more dangerous than the entity itself. The directive was clear. Any and all evidence was to be suppressed, witnesses discredited or silenced, and any public discussion dismissed as the realm of crackpots and conspiracy theorists. The lie was not a mistake. It was the official, calculated policy of every major world power for over half a century. Jack arrived at her apartment as the first gray light of dawn touched the windows. He found Sarah surrounded by printouts, her face pale but her eyes burning with a grim fire. She didn't speak. She simply handed him the most critical pages. He sat heavily in a chair, his aging hands trembling as he held the flimsy sheets of paper. He read the cold assessments of the entity's reactive intelligence, its ability to learn from and disrupt their technology. He read the stark policy directives about managed ignorance and societal preservation through controlled narrative. The words blurred before his eyes, not from tears, but from a rising cold fury that burned away the last of his grief and confusion. This was not the limited, national security cover-up he had always believed in. This was not just the Air Force protecting a secret, weapon, or hiding an embarrassing failure. This was a global, generational deception of unimaginable scope. They hadn't just hidden a UFO, they had hidden a paradigm shift. They had knowingly concealed an intelligent, ancient presence sharing the planet, and in their arrogance they had treated humanity like children, too fragile to handle the truth of their own insignificance. The full horrifying scope of the deception crashed down upon him. Every news report he'd ever seen debunking UFOs, every scientist paid to offer alternative explanations, every official who had looked him in the eye and called him crazy, all of it was part of a vast, intricate machine designed to keep humanity in the dark. He had spent 60 years believing he was guarding a dangerous military secret. He now understood he had been a prisoner in a planetary asylum, and the men in suits were not his commanders. They were his jailers. The weight of his secret was gone, replaced by the crushing, terrifying gravity of a truth that had been stolen from the entire world. The digital world, which had been Sarah's hunting ground and Jack's window into a resurgent nightmare, began to bleed. It started subtly, a flicker on a live satellite feed of the Arctic that Sarah had left running on a secondary monitor. The crisp, defined edge of the polar ice cap momentarily smeared, the pixels dissolving into a chaotic rainbow static fizzle before snapping back into focus. At first, she dismissed it as a glitch, a corrupted data packet. But then the seismic monitors, linked to a global network of university research stations, went berserk, not with the jagged spikes of tectonic activity, but with a smooth rising sine wave of harmonic vibration that registered simultaneously across dozens of sensors scattered across the Arctic Circle, a single impossible note being played on the planet's very crust. Then the real cascade began. Air traffic control feeds from Reykjavik, Oslo, and Anchorage lit up with emergency alerts. Commercial airliners on polar routes reported total instrument failure, their sophisticated navigation suites collapsing into a soup of conflicting data and screaming alarms. Military early warning stations, the most hardened and redundant systems on Earth, experienced simultaneous brownouts, their radar screens painting ghost fleets and phantom missiles before going dark, across the globe, in a perfect synchronized wave following the planet's rotation. A silent technological seizure rippled outwards from the Arctic epicenter. It was not an attack, it was an announcement. In his quiet Arizona bungalow, Jack's landline, a relic he kept for emergencies, emitted a shrill, broken ring. He picked it up to a deafening roar of static, the same all-consuming white noise that had filled his cockpit 60 years before. He dropped the receiver as if it had burned him, the plastic clattering on the floor, the static continuing to vomit from the earpiece. He didn't need the confirmation, but it came anyway. His television screen, moments ago showing a bland morning talk show, dissolved into a frantic scrolling text banner from the emergency broadcast system, reporting unprecedented, widespread communications and navigation failures of unknown origin. He stood in the center of his living room, the familiar walls seeming to press in on him. This was no echo. This was not a pattern repeating. This was the same force, the same entity he had faced in the storm-racked sky, but the tentative probing pressure he remembered was gone. In its place was a raw, unleashed power, a conscious and deliberate flexing of muscle that could reach across continents and strangle the world's technological throat with effortless ease. It was awake, truly, fully awake, and it was no longer hiding. The patient storm had broken, and he was the only man alive who knew the true nature of the hurricane. There was no more time for investigation, for cautious meetings, for digging through dusty files. The immediate terrifying reality of the awakening demanded action, and he knew with a cold, certain dread that he was the only one who could sound the alarm before the silence became permanent. The world was unraveling at the seams, and Jack Morrison stood at the center of the fray, a still point in the chaos. In Sarah's apartment, the air was thick with the scent of ozone from overworked electronics and the acrid tang of fear. News monitors flickered with images of grounded aircraft, panicked news anchors, and scrolling text about the global technological seizure. But amidst the cacophony, Jack's gaze was fixed on Sarah. He watched her, this fierce, brilliant woman who had risked everything to drag his 60-year-old ghost into the light. Her face was pale, her hands trembling slightly as she fielded a frantic call from an editor, yet her voice never wavered. She was a column of resolve in a crumbling world, her courage a stark, bright flame against the encroaching dark. That flame ignited something long dormant within him. For 6 decades he had defined himself by his silence, by his obedience to a lie. He had carried the weight of his secret not as a badge of honor, but as a penance for his survival. He believed his redemption lay in forgetting, in burying the terror so deep it could never hurt anyone again. But watching Sarah, he saw a different path. Redemption was not in silence, but in truth. It was in standing before the world, an old man with shaking hands and a haunted past, and speaking the words that governments had killed to keep secret. It was in offering his story, his pain, his vivid, terrifying memory as a shield for a humanity stumbling blindly toward a disaster only he understood. He made the decision quietly, a calm settling over him that he had not felt since before his wheels left the Greenlandic tarmac in 1962. He would go public. He would take the hidden files, his own testimony, and the grim, certain knowledge in his heart, and he would lay it all before the world. Sarah helped him draft the statement, her journalistic precision giving shape to his raw, emotional account. They contacted every major news outlet that was still broadcasting, bypassing the crumbling official channels. They would hold a press conference, not in the sterile studio, but out in the open, a defiant act of transparency in an age of lies. As he stood before the mirror in Sarah's bathroom, straightening the collar of his only good suit, Jack did not see a victim or a conspiracy theorist. He saw a witness. The hope was a fragile, flickering thing, a single candle in a vast, dark cathedral. He knew the powers that be would mobilize against him, that he would be labeled a lunatic, a traitor, a dangerous old man. He knew it might already be too late to stop what was coming, but the hope persisted. The hope that the truth, once released, could not be completely recaptured, that it would plant a seed in the public consciousness, kernel of awareness that might prevent a repeat of the panicked, fatal curiosity that had led his crew to descend into the storm. He was not just telling a story, he was issuing a warning. He was giving the world the one thing it had been denied for 60 years, a choice. The choice to face the unknown with open eyes, to meet the awe and the terror not with suppression and silence, but with the collective defiant courage of a species finally looking into the dark and refusing to blink. The final confrontation was not with the entity or with the men in suits. It was with the entity, in a denied for